Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we're traveling back to Philadelphia in the spring of 2005, where a young mother named Tanique Daniels was facing one of the most difficult decisions of her life. She had 3 children who depended on her, and she was finally ready to break free from a cycle of violence that had trapped her for too long. This isn't just a story about a crime, it's about courage, about the complex dynamics of domestic violence, and about how one woman's decision to speak up would ultimately cost her everything. As we settle in for the night, let's remember Tanique not just as a victim, but as a mother who fought for her own safety and dignity until the very end. Tanique Daniels was 27 years old in the spring of 2005, a young woman navigating the challenges of single motherhood in Philadelphia. She had 3 children who were the center of her world, and like so many mothers, she was doing everything she could to provide for them and keep them safe. Those who knew Tanique described her as determined and resilient. She had endured hardships that would have broken many people, but she kept moving forward, always thinking of her children first. She worked hard to make ends meet, and despite the struggles she faced, she maintained hope for a better future. Tanique lived in the Overbrook section of Philadelphia, a neighborhood that had seen better days but was still home to families like hers who were working to build something better. The city around her was changing, but the challenges of urban poverty remained constant: limited opportunities, dangerous relationships, and the daily struggle to keep your family safe. In her personal life, Tanique had been involved in an on-and-off relationship with a man named Glenn Hansen. Their relationship was complicated, marked by periods of closeness followed by conflict and violence. Glenn was older than Tanique, 41 years old, and he worked as a maintenance worker at a high-rise apartment building in the 1100 block of North 63rd Street. The building where Glenn worked became a significant part of their relationship. Tanique would sometimes stay there with him, though she maintained her own residence. This arrangement gave their relationship a transient quality, never quite permanent, but difficult to escape entirely. Glenn Hansen was not a stable partner. He had a history of legal troubles and a temper that made him dangerous to be around. But like many women in abusive relationships, Tanique found herself drawn back to him repeatedly, perhaps hoping that things would change, that he would change. The cycle of domestic violence is complex and difficult for outsiders to understand. It's not simply a matter of leaving, there are emotional, financial, and practical barriers that make escape feel impossible. For Tanique, with 3 children to care for, the stakes were even higher. The relationship between Tanique and Glenn had been deteriorating for months before the spring of 2005. What had once been passionate, if volatile, had become consistently dangerous. Glenn's behavior was escalating, and Tanique was beginning to realize that her safety, and possibly her life, was at risk. The incident that would change everything happened in the early months of 2005. Glenn's violence toward Tanique reached a new level of severity. The details of that assault were serious enough that Tanique ended up in the hospital emergency room, injured and frightened. But this time, something was different. This time, Tanique made a decision that would prove to be both courageous and ultimately fatal. She decided to press charges against Glenn for the assault. This wasn't just about filing a police report, this was about taking formal legal action, about standing up in court and testifying about what he had done to her. For women in abusive relationships, the decision to involve law enforcement is never simple. There's often fear of retaliation, concern about the financial impact if the abuser is the primary breadwinner, and worry about the effect on children. But Tanique had reached a point where she was no longer willing to accept the violence as normal. The assault charges against Glenn were serious. He was facing the possibility of jail time, probation, and a criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. More importantly, from his perspective, he was facing the humiliation of having his violence exposed in a public courtroom. Glenn was already on probation for previous offenses, which made these new charges even more significant. A conviction could mean not just punishment for the assault, but also consequences for violating his probation. The legal system was finally closing in on him, and he had Tanique to thank for it. As the court date approached, Glenn's anger toward Tanique intensified. He blamed her for his legal troubles, as if she had somehow forced him to hurt her. This is a common pattern in domestic violence. The abuser refuses to take responsibility for their actions and instead blames the victim for the consequences. The hearing was scheduled for May 23, 2005. Tanique would be required to testify about what Glenn had done to her, to stand in front of a judge and jury and recount the details of her assault. For Glenn, this represented the ultimate betrayal, not because he denied what he had done, but because she was refusing to protect him from the consequences. The days leading up to May 23 were filled with tension. Glenn knew that Tanique held his future in her hands. If she testified truthfully about the assault, he would almost certainly face jail time. If she could somehow be convinced to change her story, or better yet, to not show up at all, he might escape serious consequences. Glenn was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He had a history of manipulating situations to his advantage, and he was not prepared to let Tanique destroy his life, as he saw it. In his mind, she had brought this trouble on herself by refusing to keep their private business private. The apartment building where Glenn worked became a focal point during this period. He was familiar with every corner of the building, knew the routines of the residents, and had access to areas that others didn't. This knowledge would prove significant in the days to come. On May 12, 2005, 11 days before the scheduled hearing, Tanique made what would be her final visit to Glenn's apartment. She had been staying there intermittently, and despite the upcoming court date, she had not completely severed ties with him. This decision, to continue seeing him even while preparing to testify against him, illustrates the complex psychology of domestic violence situations. Perhaps Tanique hoped that they could work things out, that Glenn would accept responsibility for his actions and change his behavior. Perhaps she felt she had no choice but to maintain some kind of relationship with him. Or perhaps she simply underestimated how dangerous he had become. That evening, something happened in the apartment that would change everything. According to later testimony, Glenn made a decision that would transform him from an abuser into a murderer. The exact details of those final moments are known only because Glenn himself would later confess to them. The method Glenn chose was particularly cruel. Rather than acting in a moment of explosive anger, he made a calculated decision to end Tanique's life. He smothered her, cutting off her ability to breathe, watching as she struggled and died. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a deliberate act of silencing a woman who had dared to speak out against him. But Glenn's actions that night went beyond murder. In a disturbing display of the complete dehumanization of his victim, he engaged in acts with Tanique's body that demonstrated just how far he had fallen into depravity. These details would later shock investigators and prosecutors who had thought they had seen everything. After committing these acts, Glenn faced a practical problem. He had a body in his apartment and no plan for what to do next. The court date was still 11 days away, and people would soon begin looking for Tanique when she failed to appear. Glenn Hansen was not a master criminal, but he was familiar with the area around Philadelphia and had access to transportation. He knew that he needed to dispose of Tanique's body in a way that would make it difficult to find, and he had an idea about where to take her. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey, also known as the Pinelands, had long been a dumping ground for those looking to hide evidence of their crimes. The vast wilderness area, with its dense forests and remote locations, seemed like the perfect place to bury a body and never have it discovered. Glenn wrapped Tanique's body and loaded it into his vehicle. The drive from Philadelphia to the Pine Barrens took him through several communities, past other travelers who had no idea what was in his car. He was carrying not just a body, but the hopes and dreams of a young mother who would never see her children again. Once in the Pine Barrens, Glenn found what he thought was a suitable location. He dug a shallow grave in the sandy soil and buried Tanique's body. In his mind, this was the end of the matter. She would never be found, and without her testimony, the assault charges would likely be dropped. But Glenn had made several critical errors. First, he had chosen a location that wasn't as remote as he had thought. The area was accessible to workers and visitors, and the grave wasn't deep enough to prevent discovery. Second, he had left evidence that would eventually link him to the crime. On May 23, 2005, the day of the scheduled hearing, Tanique Daniels failed to appear in court. This wasn't entirely unusual. Witnesses in domestic violence cases sometimes decide not to testify, either out of fear or because they have reconciled with their abuser. But Tanique's absence troubled those who knew her. Glenn, meanwhile, was playing the role of the concerned boyfriend. When people asked where Tanique was, he expressed worry about her disappearance. He suggested that she might have gone to stay with relatives, or that she might have decided to leave town to avoid the court appearance. The Philadelphia Police Department opened a missing person investigation. Detective interviews with Glenn revealed inconsistencies in his story, but there wasn't enough evidence to consider him a suspect initially. He was cooperative with investigators, at least on the surface, and provided them with information about Tanique's habits and associates. But Glenn's performance wasn't as convincing as he thought it was. Investigators noted his calm demeanor when discussing Tanique's disappearance, his apparent lack of genuine concern, and his eagerness to suggest explanations for where she might have gone. Experienced detectives know that sometimes the people who seem most helpful are the ones with the most to hide. The investigation into Tanique Daniels' disappearance began as a routine missing person case, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary situation. Tanique wasn't the type of person to simply vanish without a trace, especially not when she had 3 children who depended on her. Detective work in missing person cases requires a delicate balance of hope and realism. Investigators must pursue every lead while also preparing for the possibility that they're actually working a homicide case. In Tanique's case, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance made foul play seem increasingly likely. The first major break in the case came from an unexpected source, Glenn Hansen himself. His behavior during the investigation was raising red flags, but investigators needed more than suspicion to move forward. They needed evidence, and Glenn was about to provide it. Glenn's first mistake was his inability to keep his story straight. When investigators interviewed him multiple times, his account of Tanique's final days kept changing. Details that should have been clear to someone who cared about her became fuzzy and contradictory. He couldn't remember what she had been wearing, couldn't recall their final conversations, and seemed more concerned with establishing alibis than with finding her. But Glenn's most significant error was his decision to involve his sister, Kelly Hansen, in his cover-up. Rather than keeping the secret to himself, Glenn felt compelled to share what he had done, perhaps seeking validation or simply unable to bear the burden alone. Kelly Hansen was not prepared for what her brother told her. According to her later testimony, Glenn confessed to her that he had killed Tanique, describing the murder in disturbing detail. He told her about the smothering, about his actions with the body afterward, and about burying her in the Pine Barrens. But Glenn didn't just confess to Kelly, he also asked for her help. He wanted her to provide him with an alibi, to lie to investigators about his whereabouts on the night Tanique disappeared. More disturbingly, he wanted her to come with him to see where he had buried the body. Kelly found herself in an impossible position. Her brother had confessed to murder and was asking her to become an accessory after the fact. She was torn between family loyalty and her horror at what Glenn had done. For a time, she kept his secret, but the weight of that knowledge would eventually become too much to bear. Meanwhile, investigators were following other leads. They interviewed Tanique's friends and family members, trying to piece together her final days. They learned about the domestic violence she had endured, about the upcoming court date, and about her complex relationship with Glenn. The more they learned, the more convinced they became that Glenn was responsible for her disappearance. Almost a full year passed before the breakthrough that would change everything. On April 24, 2006, workers making repairs in state forest land in the Pinelands noticed an odor coming from an area that would prove to be Tanique's final resting place. The discovery was made by chance, as so many are in cases like this. The workers weren't looking for a body, they were simply doing routine maintenance work in the forest. But the smell was unmistakable, and they knew they had found something significant. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they found the shallow grave that Glenn had dug nearly a year earlier. The body was badly decomposed, but there were still identifying features that would prove crucial to the investigation. Forensic experts were able to rehydrate skin remaining on the fingers to obtain fingerprints to prove it was Daniel's. The prosecutor said the body also had a broken leg set with steel pins, matching the injury Daniels had from an auto accident. The discovery of Tanique's body transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Now investigators had physical evidence, a crime scene, and a victim. What they needed was proof of who had killed her. The location of the body was significant for several reasons. First, it was in New Jersey, which meant that multiple law enforcement agencies would need to coordinate their efforts. Second, it was in a remote area that suggested the killer was familiar with the region. Third, it was close enough to Philadelphia to be accessible to someone who lived there. Glenn Hanson's behavior after the discovery of the body was telling. Rather than expressing shock or grief at the confirmation that Tanique was dead, he seemed more concerned with distancing himself from the crime scene. He denied any knowledge of the Pine Barrens location and claimed he had never been there. But investigators were already building a case against him. They had his inconsistent statements, his suspicious behavior during the investigation, and now they had a body. What they needed was someone to connect Glenn directly to the crime, and that someone was about to come forward. The weight of keeping her brother's secret had been destroying Kelly Hanson for months. She had been living with the knowledge that her brother had committed murder, and she had been complicit in covering it up. The discovery of Tanique's body forced her to confront the reality of what she had been hiding. Kelly Hanson's decision to come forward would prove to be the key to solving Tanique Daniels' murder. The guilt and psychological pressure of knowing what her brother had done had been eating away at her for months, and she finally reached a breaking point. When Kelly contacted investigators, she had a story that would shock even experienced homicide detectives. Her brother hadn't just confessed to killing Tanique, he had provided her with graphic details about how he had done it and what he had done afterward. Kelly Hanson said her brother told him he killed Daniels, the mother of 3 children, on May 12, 2005, to stop her from testifying against him at a May 23, 2005, domestic abuse hearing. The motive was exactly what investigators had suspected: Glenn had killed Tanique to prevent her from testifying against him. But Kelly's testimony went beyond just the confession. She revealed that Glenn had actually taken her to the location where he had buried Tanique's body. Kelly told authorities that Glenn had previously taken her to his location, which ended up being the exact location where Tanique's remains were later found. This revelation was crucial because it provided investigators with a direct link between Glenn and the crime scene. Kelly could testify that her brother had shown her the grave, had described in detail what he had done there, and had asked her to help him maintain his alibi. Kelly's testimony also revealed the calculating nature of Glenn's crime. This wasn't a crime of passion committed in a moment of anger, it was a premeditated act designed to silence someone who posed a threat to his freedom. He had planned the murder, carried it out, and then methodically covered his tracks. The confession also revealed disturbing details about Glenn's actions after the murder. His behavior with Tanique's body demonstrated a level of depravity that shocked investigators and would later horrify jurors. These details painted a picture of a man who had completely dehumanized his victim. For Kelly Hansen, coming forward was an act of courage that must have been incredibly difficult. She was essentially signing her brother's death warrant, but she was also giving Tanique's family the closure they desperately needed. Her testimony would be the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. On November 2, 2006, Glenn was arrested and charged with Tanique's murder. He was also charged with abuse of corpse. The arrest came more than a year and a half after Tanique's disappearance, but investigators had built a strong case against him. The trial of Glenn Hansen would reveal the full scope of his crimes and the impact they had on everyone involved. Gail Daniels, the victim's mother, who was in the courtroom each day of the 5-day trial, wept quietly at the verdict. For Tanique's family, the trial was both a chance for justice and a painful reminder of what they had lost. The prosecution's case was built around several key pieces of evidence. They had Kelly Hansen's testimony about her brother's confession, they had the physical evidence from the crime scene, and they had Glenn's own inconsistent statements during the investigation. One particularly damaging piece of evidence came from an unexpected source, a traffic accident. The accident, corroborated in videotaped testimony by Medford Township Police Officer Robert Carbone, occurred at 10:19 a.m. October 22, 2005, on Route 70 on the border of Medford and Woodland Townships. It was a short distance from the entrance to the Brendan T. Burns State Forest, where Daniel's body was found. This accident placed Glenn in the area where Tanique was buried, undermining his claims that he had never been there. The defense faced an uphill battle. They had to contend with Kelly Hansen's detailed testimony about her brother's confession, physical evidence linking Glenn to the crime scene, and a clear motive for the murder. Their strategy seemed to focus on challenging the credibility of witnesses and questioning the forensic evidence. But the evidence against Glenn was overwhelming. Philadelphia prosecutor Gail Fairman says the jury apparently agreed with the prosecution argument that Glenn Hansen killed his 27-year-old girlfriend, Tanique Daniels, to silence her. The motive was clear, the evidence was strong, and the testimony was convincing. A Philadelphia Common Pleas Court jury decided Tuesday that Tanique Daniels disappeared in 2005 because boyfriend Glenn Hansen murdered and then buried her in New Jersey's Pine Barrens. A Philadelphia Common Pleas Court jury this afternoon convicted Glenn Hansen of first-degree murder in the death of his girlfriend and burying her body in New Jersey's Pine Barrens in 2005. The conviction was a victory for justice, but it came at a tremendous cost. Tanique Daniels was gone, her children were without their mother, and a family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. A first-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory life prison term with no chance of parole. Glenn Hansen would spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for his decision to silence Tanique Daniels permanently. The case of Tanique Daniels is a stark reminder of the deadly reality of domestic violence. She had done everything right. She had sought medical attention for her injuries, she had pressed charges against her abuser, and she had been prepared to testify in court. But her courage in speaking out had ultimately cost her life. The statistics on domestic violence homicides are sobering. Women are most at risk of being killed by their intimate partners when they try to leave or when they take legal action against their abusers. Tanique's case illustrates this tragic pattern perfectly. But Tanique's story is also about more than victimization. It's about a mother who was trying to protect herself and create a better life for her children. It's about a woman who refused to accept violence as normal and who was willing to stand up in court to hold her abuser accountable. The courage shown by Kelly Hansen in coming forward should also be remembered. Her decision to testify against her brother couldn't have been easy, but it was necessary for justice to be served. Without her testimony, Glenn might have gotten away with murder. For Tanique's family, the conviction brought some measure of closure, but it could never bring her back. Her children would grow up without their mother, and her family would forever be marked by the violence that took her from them. The case also highlights the importance of taking domestic violence seriously. Tanique's injuries were severe enough to send her to the hospital, but Glenn was still free to harm her again. The system that was supposed to protect her, the courts, the police, the legal process, failed to keep her safe. As we conclude this story, let's remember Tanique Daniels not just as a victim, but as a mother, a daughter, and a woman who deserved so much better than the fate that befell her. Her story serves as a reminder of the work that still needs to be done to protect women from domestic violence and to ensure that speaking out against abuse doesn't become a death sentence. In the quiet of the Pine Barrens, where Tanique's body was found, there is now peace. But the echo of her courage, her decision to speak truth to power even at the ultimate cost, continues to resonate. May her memory serve as inspiration for other women facing similar circumstances, and may her story help us all understand the deadly serious nature of domestic violence. Rest in peace, Tanique Daniels. Your voice was silenced, but your story lives on. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're traveling to the heart of Silicon Valley, to the quiet suburb of Sunnyvale, California. It's a place where tech workers and families live in peaceful neighborhoods, where the biggest concerns are usually traffic and housing costs. But in March 2005, this tranquil community would become the backdrop for a story that would take 7 years to fully uncover, a story of domestic violence, betrayal, and a daughter's courage to finally speak the truth. This is the story of Raina Swirsky, a young Ukrainian woman who came to America seeking a better life, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare that would ultimately cost her everything. It's also the story of Eva Swirsky, a teenage girl who witnessed something so horrific that she carried the secret for 6 years before finding the strength to seek justice. So let me tell you about a case that demonstrates how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and how sometimes, the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest circumstances. To understand this story, we must first understand who Raina was, and how she came to be in Sunnyvale in the first place. Raina Olympia Swirsky was born in Ukraine in the early 1970s, during the final decades of the Soviet Union. She grew up in a world of political upheaval and economic uncertainty, where opportunities for young women were limited and dreams of a better life often seemed impossible to achieve. Like many Ukrainian women of her generation, Raina had heard stories of America, the land of opportunity where hard work was rewarded and where a person could build a life free from the constraints of her homeland. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Raina was still a teenager, but she had already begun dreaming of a different future. In the late 1990s, as the internet began connecting people across continents, a new phenomenon emerged: mail-order bride services. These services promised to connect Western men with Eastern European women seeking marriage and a new life in America. For women like Raina, these services represented hope, a chance to escape poverty and build a family in a land of endless possibilities. Gary Swirsky was one such man looking for a bride through these services. A wallpaper hanger living in Sunnyvale, Gary was in his 30s and had a teenage daughter named Eva from a previous relationship. He was described by neighbors as quiet, perhaps a bit antisocial, but nothing that seemed particularly alarming at the time. Through the mail-order bride service, Gary and Raina began corresponding. They exchanged letters, photographs, and eventually phone calls. Raina, who was in her late 20s by this point, saw in Gary an opportunity for the American dream she had always wanted. Gary, for his part, seemed to offer the stability and security she craved. The courtship was conducted primarily through letters and long-distance phone calls. Raina learned basic English, while Gary promised her a comfortable life in California. To a young woman from Ukraine, where economic opportunities were scarce, the promise of a middle-class life in America must have seemed like a fairy tale. In the early 2000s, Raina made the life-changing decision to leave everything she knew behind. She said goodbye to her family, her friends, and her homeland, and boarded a plane bound for San Francisco. She was embarking on what she believed would be the adventure of a lifetime, a journey that would lead her to love, stability, and happiness in the American suburbs. When Raina arrived in Sunnyvale, she found herself in a world that was both wonderful and bewildering. The prosperity of Silicon Valley was evident everywhere: well-maintained neighborhoods, new cars, shopping centers filled with goods she could never have imagined back home. But she also found herself completely dependent on Gary for everything: transportation, communication, even basic navigation through her new world. At first, the marriage seemed to work. Gary and Raina settled into married life in their modest Sunnyvale home, where Eva also lived part-time. For Raina, everything was new and exciting. She was learning English, exploring her new neighborhood, and adjusting to American customs and culture. Gary showed her around the Bay Area, taking her to San Francisco, introducing her to American food, and helping her navigate the complex processes of immigration and obtaining work authorization. To outside observers, they appeared to be a normal married couple working through the usual adjustments that come with any marriage, especially one involving such significant cultural differences. But beneath the surface, troubling patterns were beginning to emerge. Gary had very specific ideas about how his wife should behave, what she should wear, and where she should go. He monitored her activities closely, questioning her about her interactions with others and becoming suspicious of her attempts to form friendships or connections outside their home. Eva, who was living with them during this period, began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. She observed that Gary spoke to Raina in ways that seemed harsh and controlling. There were arguments that escalated beyond normal marital disagreements, and Eva began to see signs of physical altercations: bruises on Raina's arms, marks on her neck, injuries that Gary would explain away as accidents or clumsiness. Despite these warning signs, Raina was determined to make her marriage work. She had sacrificed everything to come to America, and the alternative, returning to Ukraine as a failed mail-order bride, seemed impossible to contemplate. She began looking for work, hoping that financial independence might give her more autonomy in her relationship. Eventually, Raina found employment at a Baja Fresh restaurant in Sunnyvale. The job was not glamorous, but it provided her with her first taste of independence since arriving in America. She worked hard, learning the routines and building relationships with her coworkers. Her supervisors found her to be reliable, hardworking, and eager to please. The job also introduced Raina to a world beyond her marriage. She began to understand that the way Gary treated her was not normal or acceptable. Through conversations with coworkers and customers, she learned about American attitudes toward domestic violence and women's rights. She began to realize that she had options she hadn't previously considered. However, Gary's behavior became increasingly controlling as Raina gained independence. He would question her about her work schedule, demand to know why she was coming home late, and become angry when she mentioned coworkers or customers. The verbal abuse escalated, with Gary calling her names and threatening her with deportation if she didn't comply with his demands. The physical abuse also intensified. What had started as grabbing and pushing escalated to hitting and choking. Raina began to confide in family members back in Ukraine during their phone calls, though she was careful not to reveal the full extent of her situation. She also began to seek support from people at work, though she was hesitant to provide too many details about her home life. During this period, Eva was witnessing the deterioration of her father's marriage and the escalation of his abusive behavior. As a teenager, she felt powerless to intervene, but she was deeply troubled by what she saw happening to her stepmother. The household became increasingly tense, with Gary's mood swings creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. By 2004, Raina had been working at the Baja Fresh for several years and had established herself as a valued employee. She had never missed a shift in 5 years of employment, demonstrating the work ethic and reliability that had impressed her supervisors since her first day. But more importantly, her job had given her something Gary couldn't control: relationships with people outside their home. It was through work that Raina met Ted Matman, a customer who began visiting the restaurant regularly. Ted was kind, respectful, and showed genuine interest in Raina as a person. Their conversations began casually, the typical interactions between a regular customer and a friendly employee, but gradually developed into something more meaningful. For Raina, Ted represented everything her marriage was not. He listened to her without judgment, treated her with respect, and never made her feel afraid or inadequate. As their friendship deepened, Raina began to confide in Ted about her situation at home. She told him about Gary's controlling behavior, the physical abuse, and her fear of what might happen if she tried to leave. Ted was horrified by what he learned about Raina's home life. He encouraged her to seek help, offering to support her in any way he could. He told her about domestic violence resources, helped her understand her rights as a resident of the United States, and assured her that she deserved better treatment than what she was receiving from Gary. The relationship between Raina and Ted gradually evolved from friendship to romance. For Raina, the affair represented hope, proof that she could be loved and respected by someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession. Ted made her feel valued and appreciated in ways she had never experienced in her marriage. But conducting an affair while living under Gary's watchful eye required careful planning and discretion. Raina and Ted would meet during her breaks at work, communicate through methods that Gary couldn't monitor, and plan their interactions around Gary's schedule. The secrecy added stress to Raina's already difficult situation, but it also gave her something to look forward to, a reason to endure the abuse at home. Meanwhile, Gary's suspicions were growing. He had always been jealous and possessive, but Raina's behavior had changed in ways that triggered his paranoia. She seemed happier despite the abuse, more confident in her interactions with others, and less afraid of his threats. He began to suspect that she was forming connections outside their marriage that threatened his control over her. Gary started monitoring Raina more closely, checking her work schedule, timing her commute, and questioning her about her activities during the day. He became increasingly hostile toward her co-workers, making unexpected visits to the restaurant and creating uncomfortable situations for everyone involved. The tension in the household reached a breaking point in early 2005. Gary had become convinced that Raina was having an affair, though he didn't yet know the identity of the other man. His accusations became more frequent and violent, and Raina found herself walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering his rage while continuing to see Ted whenever possible. Eva, now 16, was witnessing the final deterioration of her father's marriage. She could see that Gary was becoming increasingly unstable, and she was frightened by his behavior. She spent more time away from home, staying with friends or finding excuses to avoid being in the house when Gary and Raina were both there. Raina, meanwhile, was beginning to make plans to leave. With Ted's support, she was exploring options for ending her marriage and starting a new life. She was learning about divorce proceedings, domestic violence shelters, and resources for immigrant women in abusive relationships. For the first time since arriving in America, she was beginning to believe that escape was possible. March 9, 2005, dawned like any other day in the Swirsky household, but it would end in tragedy. Eva had plans to be out of the house for most of the day, which was typical for a teenager on a school day. She had no way of knowing that this would be the last time she would see her stepmother alive. Raina prepared for work as usual, but there was tension in the air. Gary had been increasingly paranoid and aggressive in recent days, and his accusations about her alleged affair had become more frequent and specific. He seemed to sense that something was happening that he couldn't control, and his desperation was making him more dangerous than ever. At some point during the day, Gary's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Whether through surveillance, confrontation, or discovery of evidence, he became convinced that Raina was indeed having an affair. For a man who had built his identity around controlling his wife, this revelation was the ultimate betrayal, not just of their marriage, but of the power structure he had worked so hard to maintain. The confrontation that followed was the culmination of years of escalating abuse. Gary later claimed that Raina had threatened him with a knife, forcing him to defend himself, but the evidence would suggest a different story. The physical evidence and witness testimony painted a picture of a man who had finally decided that if he couldn't control his wife, he would destroy her. The details of what happened in those final moments are known only to Gary, but the outcome was clear. Raina Swirsky, the young Ukrainian woman who had come to America seeking a better life, was strangled to death by the man who had promised to love and protect her. But Gary's crime was far from over. Having killed his wife in a moment of rage, he now faced the problem of covering up his actions. He couldn't simply report her death as an accident. The evidence of strangulation would be too obvious. He couldn't flee, as that would only confirm his guilt. Instead, he made a decision that would traumatize his daughter for years to come. In his panic, Gary called Eva and demanded that she come home immediately. Eva, who had been enjoying a normal teenage day, suddenly found herself thrust into a nightmare that would define the rest of her adolescence. When she arrived home, she was confronted with a scene that no child should ever have to witness. There, on the floor of their family home, was a bag containing the lifeless body of her stepmother. Gary, frantic and desperate, explained to his terrified daughter that he had killed Raina after discovering her affair. But rather than accepting responsibility for his actions, he made a decision that would compound his crimes exponentially. The moment Eva walked into that house and saw Raina's body in the bag, her childhood ended. At 16 years old, she was confronted with a horror that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But Gary, consumed by his own panic and self-preservation, was not finished with his daughter. According to court documents, Gary grabbed Eva by the shoulders and threatened to kill her if she did not assist him in disposing of the body. This was not a request, it was a threat delivered by a man who had just demonstrated his capacity for murder. Eva, terrified and trapped, had no choice but to comply with her father's demands. The next few hours were a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Eva was forced to help her father carry Raina's body to his vehicle, handling the remains of a woman who had been like a mother to her. The weight of what she was being forced to do, both physically and emotionally, was overwhelming for a teenage girl who should have been worrying about homework and high school social dynamics. Gary then forced Eva to accompany him on a drive to the Santa Cruz Mountains, specifically to Castle Rock State Park. During this journey, Eva sat in a vehicle with her father and the body of her murdered stepmother, knowing that her own life hung in the balance based on her compliance with Gary's demands. At Castle Rock State Park, Eva was forced to watch as Gary carried Raina's body up the mountain with a shovel. She waited in the vehicle, alone with her terror, as her father buried the woman who had been nothing but kind to her during their years living together. When Gary returned, he was no longer carrying the body. Raina Swirsky had been reduced to a secret buried in the mountains. But Gary's threats were not finished. On the drive home, he made it clear to Eva that her own life depended on her silence. He told her that he would kill her if she ever revealed what had happened to Raina. For a 16-year-old girl who had just witnessed her father commit murder, this was not an idle threat, it was a promise backed by demonstrated violence. The impact on Eva was immediate and devastating. She was now carrying the weight of a terrible secret, combined with the trauma of what she had witnessed and the ongoing fear for her own safety. She was trapped in a house with a man who had murdered her stepmother and threatened to kill her if she spoke the truth. In the days that followed, Eva watched as Gary put on a performance for the outside world. When police came to inquire about Raina's disappearance, Gary played the role of a concerned husband whose wife had simply left him. He told officers that he believed Raina was having an affair and had packed her belongings and disappeared. Eva, meanwhile, was forced to participate in this charade. She couldn't contradict her father's story without risking her own life, so she remained silent while knowing the truth about what had happened to Raina. The psychological burden of this forced deception added another layer of trauma to an already overwhelming situation. As the investigation into Raina's disappearance continued, Eva found herself in an impossible position. She wanted to tell the truth, to seek justice for Raina, and to end the nightmare she was living. But she was also terrified of her father and convinced that speaking out would result in her own death. The months and years that followed were marked by Eva's attempts to cope with the enormous psychological burden she was carrying. She struggled in school, had difficulty forming relationships, and lived in constant fear of triggering her father's violence. She was, in effect, a prisoner in her own home, held captive by a secret that was slowly destroying her mental health. While Eva was suffering in silence, the investigation into Raina's disappearance was ongoing. Ted Matman, who had been expecting to hear from Raina on March 9, became concerned when she failed to make contact. As someone who knew about Gary's abusive behavior, Ted immediately feared the worst when Raina suddenly vanished. Ted contacted the police and reported Raina missing, providing them with crucial information about her situation at home. He told officers about Gary's controlling and abusive behavior, the physical violence Raina had described, and his own concerns about her safety. This information gave investigators reason to suspect that Raina's disappearance might not be voluntary. When police interviewed Gary, they found his story about Raina simply leaving to be suspicious. His claim that his wife had packed her belongings and left because of an affair didn't align with what they learned about Raina's character and behavior patterns. Her employer at Baja Fresh told police that Raina had never missed a shift in 5 years of employment, making it unlikely that she would simply abandon her job without notice. Friends and co-workers described Raina as responsible and reliable, someone who would never disappear without telling someone where she was going. The picture that emerged was of a woman who, despite her difficult home situation, was committed to her work and her relationships with others. But despite their suspicions, police didn't have evidence that a crime had been committed. Gary's story, while suspicious, was not impossible. People did sometimes leave their marriages, even responsible people like Raina. Without a body or clear evidence of foul play, the investigation stalled. For 3 years, the case remained unsolved. Eva continued to live with her terrible secret, while Gary maintained his innocence and his story about Raina's voluntary disappearance. The truth seemed buried as deeply as Raina's body in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Then, in 2008, a group of hikers made a grim discovery in Castle Rock State Park. While exploring the area, they found a human skull among the trees and undergrowth. The remains were carefully recovered and examined by forensic experts, but initial identification was difficult due to the length of time the skull had been exposed to the elements. The skull was entered into databases and compared against missing persons reports, but the identification process was slow and methodical. Forensic anthropologists worked to determine the age, gender, and possible ethnicity of the remains, while dental records were compared against missing persons files. Finally, in 2010, 2 years after the skull's discovery, dental records confirmed what investigators had suspected: the remains belonged to Raina Swirsky. The discovery transformed the missing persons case into a homicide investigation, and the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. The identification of Raina's remains brought the case back to the forefront of the investigation. Police had long suspected that Gary was responsible for his wife's disappearance, but now they had confirmation that she had been murdered. The location of the remains in Castle Rock State Park, combined with the evidence of strangulation, painted a clear picture of what had happened. However, proving Gary's guilt in court would still require more evidence than just the discovery of Raina's remains. The case was classified as a cold case, and investigators continued to work on finding additional evidence that could lead to charges against Gary. By 2011, Eva Swirsky had been living with her terrible secret for 6 years. She was now 21 years old, no longer the frightened teenager who had been forced to help dispose of her stepmother's body. But the burden of what she knew had taken an enormous toll on her mental health and her ability to live a normal life. Eva had struggled through high school, dealing with depression, anxiety, and the constant fear of her father's threats. She had difficulty forming close relationships, as the secret she carried created a barrier between her and others. She was taking medications for depression and other mental health conditions, reflecting the long-term impact of the trauma she had experienced. The discovery of Raina's remains in 2008 and their identification in 2010 had intensified Eva's internal struggle. She knew that her father was responsible for the murder, and she knew that her testimony could provide the evidence needed to convict him. But she also continued to fear for her own safety, remembering Gary's threats to kill her if she ever spoke the truth. In February 2011, Eva reached a breaking point. The weight of carrying her secret had become unbearable, and she could no longer live with the knowledge that her father had gotten away with murder. She made the incredibly brave decision to walk into a police station and tell officers that she had information about Raina Swirsky's death. The moment Eva decided to speak the truth marked the beginning of the end for Gary's deception. She told investigators that she had a secret she could no longer live with, and then proceeded to describe the events of March 9, 2005, in detail. She explained how Gary had called her home, forced her to help dispose of Raina's body, and threatened to kill her if she ever revealed what had happened. Eva's testimony provided investigators with the missing pieces of the puzzle. She could explain how Raina's body had ended up in Castle Rock State Park, provide details about Gary's behavior on the day of the murder, and offer first-hand witness testimony about his threats and actions. Her account corroborated the physical evidence and provided the foundation for a murder case against Gary. The decision to come forward was not easy for Eva. She knew that testifying against her father would expose her to public scrutiny and force her to relive the most traumatic experience of her life. She also feared that Gary might still try to harm her, despite being in police custody. But her courage in speaking the truth finally gave Raina a voice and provided the justice she had been denied for 6 years. Eva's decision to come forward also demonstrated the long-term impact of Gary's crimes. He had not only murdered his wife but had also psychologically tortured his daughter for years, forcing her to carry the burden of his actions and threatening her life to ensure her silence. Her trauma was a testament to the far-reaching consequences of his violence. The investigation that followed Eva's testimony was thorough and methodical. Detectives worked to corroborate her account with physical evidence, witness statements, and forensic analysis. They also provided Eva with protection and support, recognizing that she was both a key witness and a victim of Gary's crimes. Armed with Eva's testimony and the physical evidence from Raina's remains, investigators finally had enough evidence to charge Gary Swirsky with murder. In February 2011, just weeks after Eva had walked into the police station, Gary was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. The arrest marked the end of Gary's 6-year deception and the beginning of the legal process that would determine his fate. Santa Clara County had just reactivated its cold case unit, and the Swirsky case became their first major success, demonstrating the value of never giving up on unsolved murders. Gary's arrest was a vindication for Ted Matman, who had never stopped believing that Gary was responsible for Raina's disappearance. It was also a relief for Eva, who could finally stop living in fear of her father's threats. The truth was now public, and Gary could no longer intimidate her into silence. The case went to trial in 2012, with Santa Clara County Prosecutor Matt Breaker leading the prosecution. The trial would be a test of whether Eva's testimony, combined with the physical evidence, would be sufficient to convince a jury of Gary's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Eva's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Now 26 years old, she took the stand and described the events of March 9, 2005, in detail. She explained how Gary had called her home, shown her Raina's body, and forced her to help dispose of the remains. She also described his threats to kill her if she ever revealed what had happened. The defense, led by attorney Homayun Mostafai, attempted to challenge Eva's credibility by highlighting her mental health struggles and the medications she was taking. They pointed out that she was taking antidepressants and antipsychotic medications, suggesting that her mental state might affect the reliability of her testimony. However, the prosecution argued that Eva's mental health issues were a direct result of the trauma Gary had inflicted on her. They contended that forcing a 16-year-old girl to help dispose of a murder victim's body and then threatening to kill her if she spoke would naturally result in long-term psychological damage. Gary himself testified during the trial, claiming that he had killed Raina in self-defense after she attacked him with a knife. He portrayed himself as the victim of domestic violence, claiming that Raina had been abusive toward him and that he had only used deadly force to protect himself. This self-defense claim was undermined by the extensive evidence of Gary's pattern of abuse toward Raina. Witnesses testified about the bruises and injuries they had seen on Raina throughout her marriage, and Ted Matman described the abuse that Raina had confided in him about. The evidence painted a picture of Gary as the aggressor, not the victim. The prosecution also presented evidence about Gary's abusive behavior toward Eva, including testimony that he had choked her during her teenage years and regularly verbally abused her. This pattern of violence toward the women in his life contradicted his claims of being a victim of domestic violence. The trial included testimony from Raina's co-workers, who described her as a reliable and hard-working employee who had never missed a shift in 5 years. This testimony contradicted Gary's story that Raina had simply left him and disappeared, as it would have been completely out of character for her to abandon her job without notice. After a 2.5-week trial, the case went to the jury for deliberation. The 6 men and 6 women who had listened to the testimony and examined the evidence had to decide whether Gary Swierski was guilty of murdering his wife or whether his claims of self-defense were credible. It took the jury just 1 day to reach their verdict. On June 20, 2012, they found Gary Swierski guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Raina Swierski. The quick deliberation suggested that the jury had found Eva's testimony credible and had rejected Gary's self-defense claims. The conviction was a vindication for Eva, who had endured years of trauma and fear before finding the courage to speak the truth. It was also a measure of justice for Raina, whose life had been cut short by a man who had promised to love and protect her. Gary was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars for his crimes. The sentence reflected the severity of his actions, not just in murdering his wife, but in the psychological torture he had inflicted on his daughter for years afterward. Deputy District Attorney Matt Breaker praised Eva's courage in coming forward, noting that it had taken tremendous strength for her to testify against her father. He emphasized that without her testimony, Gary might never have been brought to justice for his crimes. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by mail-order brides and immigrant women in abusive relationships. Raina's isolation, language barriers, and dependence on Gary for her immigration status had made her particularly vulnerable to abuse and control. Her story served as a reminder of the need for better protections for immigrant women in domestic violence situations. For Eva, the trial's conclusion marked the end of one chapter in her life but the beginning of another. She had finally been freed from the burden of her secret, but she would continue to deal with the long-term psychological effects of her trauma. Her courage in speaking the truth had not only brought justice for Raina but had also demonstrated the strength of survivors of domestic violence. The case also revealed that Gary had potentially committed other violent crimes that had gone unpunished. Prosecutors suggested that he might have gotten away with a previous murder, highlighting the importance of thoroughly investigating patterns of domestic violence and taking threats seriously. The murder of Raina Swierski is a story that reminds us of the hidden violence that can exist behind closed doors, even in the most seemingly ordinary neighborhoods. It's a story of a woman who traveled across the world seeking a better life, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare of abuse and control. But it's also a story of courage and redemption. Eva Swierski's decision to speak the truth, despite years of threats and trauma, demonstrated that even the most frightened victims can find the strength to seek justice. Her testimony not only brought her father to justice but also gave voice to her stepmother, who could no longer speak for herself. The case serves as a reminder that domestic violence affects women of all backgrounds, but immigrant women and mail-order brides face particular vulnerabilities that make them easy targets for abusers. Raina's story highlights the need for better protections and support systems for these vulnerable populations. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded that justice sometimes takes years to achieve, but it's never too late to speak the truth. Eva's courage in coming forward after 6 years of silence shows that survivors of domestic violence can find their voice, even when the odds seem impossible. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Raina Swierski, a young woman who deserved better than the fate that befell her. Remember Eva Swierski, a daughter who found the courage to do what was right, even when it was the hardest thing she would ever do. And remember that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives were forever changed by violence, but but whose stories serve as important reminders about the need for justice, protection, and hope. The murder of Raina Swirsky is closed, but her story continues to resonate as a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the importance of never giving up on the pursuit of truth and justice. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to northeastern Wisconsin, where the forests of the Menominee Indian Reservation hold secrets that have yet to be fully revealed. This is the story of Caitlin Kelly, a 22-year-old Menominee woman whose disappearance in June 2020 would become part of a larger, heartbreaking pattern affecting indigenous communities across North America. The case of Caitlin Kelly is not just a story of one woman's tragic fate, but a window into the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, known as MMIW. Her story reminds us that behind every statistic is a person with dreams, family, and a future that was cut short. To understand Caitlin's story, we must first understand the place she called home. The Menominee Indian Reservation spans approximately 353 square miles in northeastern Wisconsin, primarily in Menominee County. It's a place where tradition meets modernity, where the Menominee people have maintained their cultural identity while navigating the challenges of contemporary life. The Menominee Nation has a rich history dating back thousands of years. Originally occupying vast territories across the Great Lakes region, the Menominee people were skilled hunters, fishermen, and gatherers who lived in harmony with the dense forests and waterways of Wisconsin. The name Menominee itself comes from the Ojibwe word Manomin, meaning wild rice people, reflecting their deep connection to the land and its resources. By the 1850s, the Menominee had been forced onto a reservation through a series of treaties with the U.S. government. Despite these challenges, the community persevered, maintaining their language, traditions, and strong sense of identity. The reservation today is home to approximately 4,000 tribal members, though many more Menominee people live throughout Wisconsin and beyond. The landscape of the reservation is one of rolling hills, dense forests, and pristine lakes. It's a place where the modern world coexists with ancient traditions, where casino lights shine alongside traditional powwow grounds, and where families like Caitlin's have deep roots stretching back generations. Caitlin Kelly was born into this community in 1998, a young woman who embodied both the struggles and aspirations of her generation. At 22, she was at that pivotal age where life's possibilities seemed endless, yet the weight of adult responsibilities was beginning to settle in. Those who knew Caitlin described her as a vibrant young woman with a warm personality and a strong connection to her family. She was particularly close to her mother, who would later become her most devoted advocate in the search for answers. Caitlin had dreams and plans for her future, the kind of everyday hopes that make a person's absence all the more profound. She lived in Shawano, a small city just outside the reservation boundaries. Shawano, with a population of around 9,000, serves as a regional hub for the area. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where news travels fast, and where a young woman's disappearance would send ripples of concern throughout the community. Caitlin's daily life was typical of many young adults in rural Wisconsin. She navigated between the reservation where her family and cultural roots ran deep, and the broader community of Shawano where she had made her home. This dual existence, being rooted in tribal identity while living in the wider world, is a common experience for many indigenous people of her generation. The early months of 2020 were a time of unprecedented uncertainty for communities across America. The COVID-19 pandemic had begun to reshape daily life, bringing with it economic hardship, social isolation, and a general sense of unease that permeated even the most remote communities. For the Menominee Nation, like many tribal communities, the pandemic posed particular challenges. Tribal lands often have limited healthcare infrastructure, and the historical trauma of disease outbreaks made tribal leaders particularly cautious about protecting their people. Many tribal businesses, including casinos that provide crucial revenue for the community, had closed or limited operations. In this context, Caitlin was navigating her own challenges. The details of her specific circumstances in the days before her disappearance paint a picture of a young woman dealing with the same kinds of pressures that many her age faced during this difficult time. According to family members, Caitlin had been in regular contact with her loved ones in the days before June 16. She was known to check in frequently with her mother, making her subsequent silence all the more alarming. The last normal conversations she had with family members would later be scrutinized for any clues about what might have happened to her. The evening of June 16, 2020, began like any other for Caitlin Kelly. She was at her apartment in Shawano, going about her usual routines. But as the night wore on, a series of events would unfold that would change everything. According to the timeline established by investigators, Caitlin was last seen during the overnight hours of June 16 and the early morning of June 17. The specific details of her last known whereabouts tell a story of movement between two important places in her life, her apartment in Shawano and the Menominee Indian Reservation. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on June 16, Caitlin was spotted in the area of County Highway VV and Silver Canoe Road on the Menominee Indian Reservation. This location, about 15 miles east of Shawano, is in a relatively remote area of the reservation. The fact that she was seen there suggests she had traveled from her apartment to the reservation for some purpose. The significance of this location cannot be understated. County Highway VV runs through some of the more isolated areas of the reservation, passing through dense forests and past scattered homes. Silver Canoe Road, as its name suggests, leads toward one of the many waterways that dot the reservation landscape. It's the kind of place where someone might go to meet someone they knew, or where they might find themselves if they had accepted a ride from someone offering help. Witnesses reported seeing Caitlin in this area, and it appeared she was picked up by someone who offered her a ride. This detail would become crucial to the investigation, as it suggested that Caitlin's disappearance might not have been random, but could have involved someone she knew or trusted enough to accept assistance from. The ride, investigators believe, was back to Shawano. This would make sense. If Caitlin had somehow found herself stranded on the reservation late at night, accepting a ride back to her apartment would be a natural response. The distance between the reservation and Shawano is significant enough that walking would not have been practical, especially in the dark. What happened during that ride, or after Caitlin arrived back in Shawano, remains one of the central mysteries of the case. Was she safely delivered to her apartment? Did something happen during the journey? These questions would haunt investigators and her family for months to come. When Caitlin's mother reported her missing on June 18, 2020, it marked the beginning of what would become an exhaustive search effort. The 48-hour delay between Caitlin's last known sighting and the missing person report might seem significant, but it's important to understand the context. In many families, especially among young adults, it's not uncommon for someone to be out of touch for a day or two. Caitlin's mother later explained that while it was unusual for her daughter not to check in, she initially hoped there was a simple explanation. Perhaps Caitlin's phone had died, or she was staying with a friend, or she had simply gotten busy with other things. But as the hours passed without any word from Caitlin, her mother's concern grew. She began calling Caitlin's friends and acquaintances, checking to see if anyone had heard from her. When these calls yielded no information, she knew something was seriously wrong. The Menominee Tribal Police Department took the report seriously from the start. In a small community like theirs, everyone knew everyone, and the disappearance of a young woman was cause for immediate alarm. The tribal police began their investigation by retracing Caitlin's known movements and interviewing anyone who might have seen her in the days before her disappearance. The search effort quickly expanded beyond the initial police investigation. Family members, friends, and community volunteers joined in looking for any sign of Caitlin. They organized search parties that combed through the forests and fields of the reservation, checked along roadways and near bodies of water, and distributed flyers with Caitlin's photograph throughout the area. The Menominee Tribal Police also reached out to other law enforcement agencies for assistance. The investigation involved multiple jurisdictions because Caitlin's movements had taken her between the reservation and Shawano, which fell under different police authorities. This multi-jurisdictional aspect would become both a resource and a challenge in the investigation. The response to Caitlin's disappearance revealed the strength and unity of the Menominee community. Within days of her being reported missing, volunteers had organized extensive search efforts. These weren't just casual searches, but systematic efforts involving dozens of people who knew the reservation's landscape intimately. The searches took place in terrain that could be challenging even for experienced outdoors people. The Menominee Reservation is heavily forested, with dense stands of pine, oak, and maple trees that can make visibility difficult. There are numerous streams, ponds, and wetland areas that needed to be checked. The volunteers, many of whom were tribal members with deep knowledge of the land, searched on foot, by ATV, and even by boat in the reservation's waterways. Social media played a crucial role in spreading awareness about Caitlin's disappearance. Family members and friends shared her photograph and details about her case across Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms. The hashtag #MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, began appearing alongside posts about Caitlin, connecting her case to the broader movement seeking justice for Indigenous women who had disappeared or been murdered. The tribal government also took action. The Menominee Nation offered a reward for information leading to Caitlin's whereabouts. This reward, while modest by some standards, represented a significant commitment from a tribal government working with limited resources. Caitlin's disappearance occurred against the backdrop of a crisis that has been affecting Indigenous communities across North America for decades. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, MMIW, crisis represents one of the most pressing human rights issues facing Native American communities today. The statistics are staggering and heartbreaking. According to the National Crime Information Center, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls in 2016 alone. However, the Department of Justice's Federal Missing Persons Database, NAMUS, contained only 116 cases of missing Indigenous women. This discrepancy highlights a systemic problem in how cases involving Indigenous people are tracked and investigated. The crisis is even more severe when looking at murder rates. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, homicide is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women aged 10 to 24, and the fifth leading cause for Indigenous women aged 25 to 34. Indigenous women are murdered at rates more than 10 times the national average. These aren't just statistics, they represent mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives have been cut short, whose families have been left without answers, and whose communities have been traumatized by loss. Each case represents a unique individual with her own story, dreams, and potential contributions to her community. The reasons behind the MMIW crisis are complex and deeply rooted in historical trauma, jurisdictional challenges, and systemic discrimination. Many Indigenous communities are located in remote areas where law enforcement resources are limited. The complex web of federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions can create confusion and delays in investigations. Caitlin's case embodied many of these challenges. Her disappearance occurred in an area where tribal, county, and state jurisdictions overlapped. The investigation required coordination between multiple agencies, each with their own procedures and priorities. As weeks turned into months, the investigation into Caitlin's disappearance continued with the dedication of tribal police, state investigators, and federal agents. The FBI became involved, bringing additional resources and expertise to the case. This federal involvement was significant, as it provided access to forensic capabilities and investigative techniques that might not have been available to local law enforcement. Investigators followed every lead, no matter how small. They interviewed dozens of people who might have had contact with Caitlin in the days before her disappearance. They analyzed her phone records, looking for clues about who she might have been in contact with. They examined her social media accounts for any signs of trouble or plans that might explain her disappearance. The investigation also involved extensive searches of the reservation and surrounding areas. Search teams used cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains, even those that might be deeply buried or submerged in water. They searched abandoned buildings, dense forest areas, and remote locations where someone might have hidden evidence. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the vast area that needed to be searched. The Menominee Reservation covers hundreds of square miles, much of it densely forested and difficult to access. Beyond the reservation boundaries, the surrounding counties contain thousands of additional square miles of potential search area. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Caitlin might have left the area voluntarily or been taken to a location far from where she was last seen. This meant coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Wisconsin and potentially in neighboring states. After 9 months of searching, hoping, and investigating, the breakthrough came in March 2021. On March 17, 2021, human remains were discovered on the Menominee Indian Reservation. The discovery was made by someone who was familiar with the area and noticed something that didn't seem right. The location where the remains were found was in a remote area of the reservation, the kind of place where someone might go to hide evidence or where remains might lie undiscovered for extended periods. The dense forest canopy and undergrowth would have made the area difficult to search thoroughly, especially during the summer months when vegetation was at its thickest. The discovery of human remains always brings a mixture of emotions for the families of missing persons. There's the relief that comes with finally having answers, but also the devastating confirmation that their worst fears have been realized. For Caitlin's family, the discovery meant the end of the agonizing uncertainty about her fate, but also the beginning of a new kind of grief. The remains were transported to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory for examination. Forensic anthropologists and pathologists worked to identify the remains and determine the cause of death. This process involves careful analysis of dental records, DNA, and other identifying characteristics. On March 24, 2021, the identification was confirmed. The remains belonged to Caitlin Kelly. The young woman who had been missing for 9 months had been found, but her death raised new questions about what had happened to her and who was responsible. With the discovery and identification of Caitlin's remains, the investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation. The Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory conducted an autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. The results would provide crucial information about what had happened to Caitlin and potentially point investigators toward whoever was responsible. The exact details of the autopsy findings have not been made public, which is typical in ongoing homicide investigations. However, the fact that the death was ruled a homicide indicates that investigators found evidence that Caitlin had been killed by another person, rather than dying from natural causes or suicide. The homicide ruling also meant that the investigation would receive additional resources and attention. Homicide cases are given the highest priority by law enforcement agencies, and the FBI's involvement ensured that the case would have access to the most advanced forensic techniques and investigative resources available. For the Menominee Tribal Police, this was likely one of the most serious cases they had ever handled. Tribal police departments often deal with a wide range of issues, from traffic violations to domestic disputes, but homicide cases are relatively rare. The complexity of a homicide investigation, combined with the jurisdictional challenges involved, made this a particularly difficult case to work. The investigation now focused on building a timeline of Caitlin's last hours, identifying potential suspects, and gathering evidence that could lead to an arrest and conviction. This involved re-interviewing witnesses, analyzing forensic evidence from the scene where the remains were found, and exploring any new leads that might have emerged. As of the time of this recording, the investigation into Caitlin Kelly's murder remains active and ongoing. Despite the extensive efforts of law enforcement agencies, no arrests have been made in connection with her death. This lack of resolution has been frustrating for her family and the community, but it doesn't mean that investigators have given up. Cold cases, as they're sometimes called, can remain open for years or even decades before new evidence or witnesses come forward. Advances in forensic technology, changes in witness willingness to cooperate, and the discovery of new evidence can all potentially lead to breakthroughs in cases that have seemed unsolvable. The Menominee Tribal Police continue to ask for the public's help in solving Caitlin's case. They maintain a tip line for anyone who might have information about her disappearance and murder. Even seemingly small details that might not have seemed important at the time could prove crucial to the investigation. The case has also highlighted the need for improved coordination between different law enforcement agencies when dealing with crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries. The complex web of federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions can create challenges in investigations, but it can also provide opportunities for sharing resources and expertise. Throughout this ordeal, Caitlin's family has shown remarkable strength and determination. Her mother, in particular, has become an advocate not just for her daughter's case, but for all missing and murdered Indigenous women. She has spoken at public events, worked with lawmakers, and participated in awareness campaigns designed to bring attention to the MMIW crisis. The family's advocacy has helped keep Caitlin's case in the public eye, even as months have passed without an arrest. They have organized memorial events, participated in community gatherings, and used social media to continue raising awareness about her case and the broader issues it represents. For families of murder victims, the quest for justice can become a defining aspect of their lives. The need to find answers, to hold someone accountable, and to prevent similar tragedies from happening to others can drive families to become advocates and activists in ways they never imagined. Caitlin's family has also found support within the broader community of families affected by the MMIW crisis. There's a network of mothers, sisters, and other family members who have lost loved ones to violence, and they provide each other with understanding and support that comes from shared experience. The murder of Caitlin Kelly has had a profound impact on the Menominee community and the broader region. In a small, close-knit community, the loss of a young person to violence creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate family. The case has brought attention to the challenges facing Indigenous communities in terms of public safety and law enforcement. It has highlighted the need for better resources, improved coordination between agencies, and increased awareness of the particular vulnerabilities that Indigenous women face. Community members have organized various events to honor Caitlin's memory and to raise awareness about the MMIW crisis. These events serve multiple purposes. They keep Caitlin's case in the public consciousness, they provide support for her family, and they educate the broader community about the issues facing Indigenous women. The case has also sparked discussions about how to better protect Indigenous women and girls from violence. This includes conversations about improving law enforcement response, providing better support services for those at risk, and addressing the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to violence against Indigenous women. The case of Caitlin Kelly represents both a personal tragedy and a broader social crisis. Her death is a loss not just for her family and friends, but for the entire Menominee community and for all those who believe in justice and human dignity. As we conclude this examination of Caitlin's case, it's important to remember that behind all the investigative details and legal proceedings is a young woman who deserved to live a full and happy life. She had dreams, aspirations, and the potential to contribute to her community in meaningful ways. Her death has robbed not just her family, but the world, of whatever contributions she might have made. The investigation into her murder continues, and there remains hope that justice will eventually be served. Cases that seem unsolvable can sometimes be cracked by new evidence, advancing technology, or witnesses who finally decide to come forward. The dedication of law enforcement officials, the persistence of her family, and the support of the community all contribute to keeping the case active and increasing the chances that it will eventually be solved. Caitlin's case also serves as a reminder of the ongoing crisis affecting Indigenous communities across North America. The missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis represents thousands of individual tragedies like Caitlin's, each one representing a life cut short and a family left without answers. The movement to address this crisis has gained momentum in recent years, with increased government attention, better data collection, and improved coordination between agencies. But much work remains to be done to ensure that Indigenous women and girls receive the protection and justice they deserve. As we remember Caitlin Kelly, we honor not just her memory, but the memories of all the Indigenous women and girls who have been lost to violence. Their stories matter, their lives had value, and their families deserve justice. The fight for that justice continues, and it's a fight that requires the attention and support of all members of society. The case of Caitlin Kelly remains open, and investigators continue to seek the truth about what happened to her. If you have any information about her disappearance or murder, please contact the Menominee Tribal Police Department. Your information, no matter how small it might seem, could be the key to finally bringing justice for Caitlin and peace for her family. Tonight, as we close this examination of Caitlin's case, we do so with the hope that justice will ultimately prevail, that her family will find the answers they seek, and that her story will contribute to preventing similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Caitlin Kelly's life mattered, her death demands justice, and her memory deserves to be honored. Please, I'm putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we're exploring a case that spans nearly 6 years of heartbreak, hope, and ultimately, devastating discovery. This is the story of Miranda Rodriguez, a young woman whose disappearance during one of Houston's most catastrophic natural disasters led to one of the most unusual crime discoveries in recent Texas history. Our story begins in the summer of 2017, when Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on Houston, Texas. It was a time when families were coming together, securing their homes, and preparing for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. But for one family, the approaching storm would mark the beginning of a mystery that would last nearly 6 years. Miranda Marie Rodriguez was 24 years old in August 2017. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she walked in, that's what everyone who knew her would tell you. Born and raised in Houston, Miranda had deep roots in the community that would later rally around her family during their darkest hours. She had that infectious laugh that seemed to echo long after she'd left a room. Friends described her as someone who never met a stranger, always ready with a warm greeting and genuine interest in others' lives. Miranda worked in the service industry, where her natural people skills made her a favorite among both customers and co-workers. Like many young adults in Houston, Miranda was navigating the complexities of building her life. She had dreams, ambitions, and the kind of optimism that comes with being in your 20s and believing the world is full of possibilities. She was close to her family, particularly her parents, who had always been her anchor through life's ups and downs. Miranda lived in southeast Houston, an area known for its tight-knit communities and working-class neighborhoods. It was the kind of place where people looked out for each other, where families had barbecues in their backyards and children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. It was home, in every sense of the word. But by August 2017, Miranda was facing some challenges. Like many young people, she was working to establish her independence while maintaining those crucial family connections. She had been staying at various places, sometimes with friends, sometimes on her own, as she figured out her next steps in life. Those who knew Miranda well would later say that despite any struggles she might have been facing, she was resilient. She had that quality that many young people possess, the ability to bounce back from setbacks and maintain hope for the future. She was someone who believed in tomorrow, who made plans and looked forward to what was coming next. August 25, 2017, was a date that would be burned into the collective memory of Houston residents. Hurricane Harvey was approaching the Texas coast as a Category 4 storm, bringing with it the promise of catastrophic flooding and destruction. Weather forecasters were using words like unprecedented and historic to describe what was coming. For families across Houston, this was a time of preparation and anxiety. Hardware stores were emptying of plywood and batteries. Grocery stores saw runs on water and non-perishable food. But most importantly, families were making plans to stay together, to ride out the storm in the safety of each other's company. Miranda's family was no different. Her parents, like thousands of other Houston families, were making arrangements to ensure their loved ones would be safe during the hurricane. They had prepared their home, gathered supplies, and reached out to family members to coordinate their hurricane plans. The plan was simple and logical. Miranda would be picked up and brought to her parents' home, where the family would wait out Hurricane Harvey together. It was the kind of plan that families across Houston were making, practical, sensible, and based on the fundamental principle that during times of crisis, families stick together. But as the hours ticked by on August 25th, and the outer bands of Hurricane Harvey began to lash the Texas coast, Miranda's family waited for her arrival. They had arranged for someone to pick her up, to bring her to safety, to bring her home where she belonged during this time of uncertainty. The winds were picking up, and the first drops of what would become historic rainfall were beginning to fall. Across Houston, families were settling in for what they knew would be a long, difficult night. Television weather reports showed the massive spiral of Hurricane Harvey approaching the coast, its eye wall clearly visible on radar screens across the city. Miranda's family continued to wait. Phone calls were made, text messages sent. The storm was getting closer, and the window for safe travel was rapidly closing. But Miranda never arrived at her parents' home that night. As Hurricane Harvey made landfall and began its devastating march across southeast Texas, Miranda Rodriguez had simply vanished. The last confirmed sighting of her was on August 25, 2017, the very day the hurricane struck. She was supposed to be picked up, supposed to join her family for safety, supposed to be starting a new chapter after the storm passed. Instead, August 25 became the last day anyone could say with certainty that they had seen Miranda Rodriguez alive. The timing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey brought with it unprecedented flooding that would eventually dump more than 50 inches of rain on parts of Houston. Entire neighborhoods were underwater. Roads became impassable rivers. Emergency services were overwhelmed with rescue operations. The entire city was in crisis mode. For Miranda's family, the hurricane became a double nightmare. Not only were they dealing with the immediate dangers and disruptions of the storm, but they were also grappling with the terrifying reality that their daughter and sister had disappeared just as the city was plunging into chaos. Imagine the helplessness they must have felt. Outside their windows, Houston was flooding. Emergency services were stretched to their limits, rescuing people from rooftops and flooded homes. The normal channels for reporting a missing person and beginning a search were complicated by the fact that the entire city was in emergency mode. Miranda's sister, Brandy Rodriguez, would later describe those early days as a blur of panic and confusion. How do you search for someone when the entire city is underwater? How do you get answers when everyone is focused on immediate survival? How do you maintain hope when the world around you seems to be falling apart? The hurricane raged for days, dumping rain and flooding neighborhoods that had never flooded before. When the waters finally began to recede, Houston faced the monumental task of recovery. Families were displaced, businesses destroyed, and entire communities were working to rebuild their lives. But for the Rodriguez family, the end of Hurricane Harvey marked the beginning of a different kind of storm, the long, agonizing search for answers about what had happened to Miranda. As Houston began to rebuild, they began to search, holding on to hope that their daughter and sister would be found safe. The missing person report was filed as soon as it was possible to do so. Miranda's photograph was distributed, her information was entered into databases, and the slow, methodical process of searching for a missing person began. But in a city that had been turned upside down by natural disaster, finding one missing person seemed like an overwhelming task. In the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, as Houston began the long process of drying out and rebuilding, the Rodriguez family faced a challenge that felt almost impossible. How do you search for someone in a city that had been fundamentally changed by disaster? How do you find answers when everything familiar has been disrupted? Miranda's family refused to give up. They understood that in the chaos following the hurricane, their daughter's disappearance might not receive the attention it deserved. Emergency services were overwhelmed, the police were dealing with storm-related incidents, and the entire city was focused on recovery. But they also knew that every day that passed without answers was a day that the trail grew colder. Brandy Rodriguez, Miranda's sister, became one of the most vocal advocates for finding answers. She organized search efforts, distributed flyers, and used social media to keep Miranda's story in the public eye. She understood that in a city recovering from disaster, it would be easy for one missing person to be forgotten among all the other priorities. The family created Facebook pages dedicated to finding Miranda. They organized volunteer search parties, coordinated with local law enforcement, and reached out to anyone who might have information about Miranda's last known whereabouts. They refused to let their daughter and sister become just another statistic in the chaos of post-Hurricane Houston. But searching for someone in post-Harvey Houston presented unique challenges. Entire neighborhoods had been evacuated and were still uninhabitable. Records had been destroyed by flooding. Businesses were closed, displaced, or destroyed entirely. The normal network of people and places that might provide clues about a missing person had been disrupted. Miranda's family also had to navigate the complex emotions of hope and despair. In the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster, it was possible to hope that Miranda had simply been displaced by the storm, that she was safe somewhere and unable to contact her family. Perhaps she had evacuated to another city, or was staying with friends whose contact information had been lost in the chaos. As weeks turned into months, however, that hope became harder to maintain. The family had to face the possibility that something more sinister had happened to Miranda. They had to consider that her disappearance might not be storm-related at all, but could be the result of foul play. Law enforcement agencies were doing what they could, but they were also dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane. The Houston Police Department had been involved in thousands of rescue operations during the storm, and was now dealing with the various crimes and incidents that inevitably follow natural disasters. Miranda's case was important, but it was one of many competing priorities. The family's search efforts expanded beyond Houston. They reached out to other Texas cities where Miranda might have gone, contacted shelters and aid organizations, and explored every possible avenue for finding their missing loved one. They appeared on local news programs, gave interviews to reporters, and did everything they could to keep Miranda's story in the public consciousness. As 2017 turned into 2018, and then 2019, and then 2020, Miranda Rodriguez remained missing. For her family, each passing year brought a complex mix of emotions. There was the persistent hope that she might still be found alive, coupled with the growing fear that something terrible had happened to her. The family's search efforts never stopped, but they evolved over time. Social media posts continued, but they took on a more desperate tone. Anniversary dates, Miranda's birthday, the day she disappeared, holidays, became particularly difficult times for the family. Each of these occasions was a reminder of the empty space that Miranda's absence had created in their lives. Brandy Rodriguez continued to be a tireless advocate for her sister. She maintained the Facebook pages, continued to share Miranda's story, and never stopped hoping that someone, somewhere, might have information that could bring their family closure. She understood that public attention was crucial to keeping Miranda's case active, and she refused to let her sister be forgotten. The family also had to navigate the practical challenges of having a missing loved one. There were legal issues to consider, financial matters to address, and the constant uncertainty of not knowing whether Miranda was alive or dead. These practical concerns added another layer of stress to an already unbearable situation. Over the years, there were occasional leads and tips, but none of them led to Miranda. Each false hope was devastating, but the family continued to follow every possible lead. They understood that finding Miranda might require years of persistence, and they were prepared to continue searching for as long as it took. The Houston area continued to recover from Hurricane Harvey, and life gradually returned to normal for most residents. New businesses opened, damaged homes were repaired, and the city moved forward. But for the Rodriguez family, time seemed frozen at August 25, 2017, the day their daughter and sister vanished. They attended vigils for other missing persons, connected with other families going through similar experiences, and became part of the broader community of people searching for lost loved ones. They learned that their pain was shared by others, and that the search for answers was often a long and difficult journey. As the years passed, the family also had to confront the possibility that they might never get answers. They had to find ways to honor Miranda's memory while still maintaining hope that she might be found. They had to learn to live with uncertainty, to function in a world where the most important question in their lives remained unanswered. July 2022 dawned like any other summer day in Houston. The city was hot and humid, with the kind of weather that drives people indoors during the middle of the day. In southeast Houston, on Peach Creek Drive, a family had hired some workers to clean up their backyard. It was routine maintenance, the kind of work that homeowners across Houston hire contractors to do during the summer months. The workers were experienced landscapers, accustomed to dealing with overgrown yards, discarded items, and the various challenges that come with cleaning up residential properties. They had been hired to clear out debris and clean up the backyard, which included an old barbecue pit that hadn't been used in some time. The house on Peach Creek Drive was in a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where families raised children and neighbors knew each other by name. It was an area that had been affected by Hurricane Harvey's flooding, like so much of Houston, but had recovered and rebuilt in the years since the storm. As the workers began their task of cleaning out the barbecue pit, they expected to find the usual debris, old charcoal, maybe some discarded grilling equipment, perhaps some trash that had accumulated over time. What they discovered instead would change everything for the Rodriguez family and shock the Houston community. Inside the barbecue pit, the workers found what appeared to be human skeletal remains. The bones were charred and had clearly been burned, but they were unmistakably human. The discovery was so unexpected and disturbing that the workers immediately stopped their work and contacted authorities. The Houston Police Department responded quickly to the scene. Crime scene investigators, forensic specialists, and detectives converged on the Peach Creek Drive address. The barbecue pit was carefully processed as a potential crime scene, and the skeletal remains were carefully removed and transported to the Harris County Medical Examiner's office. For the investigators, this discovery raised immediate questions. How had human remains ended up in a residential barbecue pit? How long had they been there? Who was this person, and what had happened to them? The location was particularly puzzling. This was a residential neighborhood, not the kind of place where one would expect to find evidence of a violent crime. The medical examiner's office began the painstaking process of examining the remains. Forensic anthropologists were called in to analyze the bones, to determine the age, sex, and other characteristics of the deceased person. DNA samples were taken for comparison with missing persons databases. The investigation was thorough but necessarily slow. Forensic analysis takes time, and the condition of the remains made identification challenging. Meanwhile, the discovery made local news. Reports of human remains found in a barbecue pit captured public attention, both because of the unusual nature of the discovery and because of the questions it raised about what had happened at this residential address. The story spread across Houston's news outlets and social media, reaching thousands of people who wondered about the identity of the person found in the barbecue pit. For families of missing persons across Houston, this discovery brought both hope and fear. Could these remains be their missing loved one? Was this finally the answer they had been searching for, or would this be another dead end in their long search for closure? The Rodriguez family, like other families of missing persons, followed the news of the discovery with intense interest. After nearly 5 years of searching for Miranda, they had learned to manage their expectations about potential developments in the case. But the discovery on Peach Creek Drive was significant enough that they couldn't help but wonder, could this finally be the answer they had been seeking? The process of identifying human remains is painstakingly slow, especially when the remains have been severely damaged by fire. The Harris County Medical Examiner's Office worked methodically through the summer and fall of 2022, conducting tests and comparisons that would hopefully provide answers about the identity of the person found in the barbecue pit. For the Rodriguez family, this waiting period was particularly difficult. They had spent nearly 5 years wondering what had happened to Miranda, and now there was a possibility, just a possibility, that these remains might be their missing daughter and sister. But they also knew that getting definitive answers would take time, and that there was no guarantee that these remains would provide the closure they sought. The medical examiner's office had to work carefully and thoroughly. DNA analysis takes time, especially when dealing with degraded samples. The remains had to be examined by forensic anthropologists, who could determine characteristics like age, sex, and height. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully documented and analyzed. During this waiting period, the Rodriguez family continued their usual routines, but the discovery on Peach Creek Drive was never far from their minds. They had learned over the years to manage their expectations about potential developments in Miranda's case, but this discovery felt different. The timing, the location, the unusual circumstances, all of it seemed to point toward the possibility that this might finally be the answer they had been seeking. The Houston Police Department was also working to understand the circumstances surrounding the discovery. They were investigating the history of the property on Peach Creek Drive, trying to determine who had access to the backyard and when the remains might have been placed there. They were also working to establish any connections between the property and known missing persons cases. As months passed, the investigation continued. The medical examiner's office worked through their backlog of cases, conducted additional tests, and compared the remains with missing persons databases. The process was thorough but necessarily slow, and the Rodriguez family had to continue waiting for answers that might never come. The discovery had also raised questions in the community about safety and security in residential neighborhoods. How could human remains end up in a backyard barbecue pit without anyone noticing? What did this mean for the safety of the neighborhood? These questions added another layer of complexity to an already unusual case. July 2023, almost exactly 1 year after the discovery of the skeletal remains, brought the news that the Rodriguez family had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The Harris County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed that the remains found in the barbecue pit on Peach Creek Drive were those of Miranda Marie Rodriguez. The identification was made through DNA analysis, which provided definitive proof that the remains belonged to the young woman who had disappeared during Hurricane Harvey nearly 6 years earlier. For the Rodriguez family, this confirmation brought a complex mix of emotions: relief at finally having answers, but devastating grief at the confirmation of their worst fears. Brandy Rodriguez, who had spent nearly 6 years searching for her sister, later described receiving the news as heartbreaking. After years of hope, years of searching, years of wondering, the family finally had the answer they had been seeking. But it was not the answer they had hoped for. The confirmation that the remains belonged to Miranda raised new questions about what had happened to her. How had she ended up in a barbecue pit in a residential neighborhood? Who was responsible for her death? What had happened during those final days of August 2017 that led to this tragic outcome? The address on Peach Creek Drive was not familiar to Miranda's family. They had never known her to have connections to that particular neighborhood, and they couldn't understand how or why she would have ended up there. This added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The Houston Police Department reclassified Miranda's case as a homicide investigation. The circumstances of her death, the fact that her remains were found burned in a barbecue pit, clearly indicated that she had been the victim of a violent crime. This was not an accident, not a natural death, but a deliberate act of violence. For the Rodriguez family, the confirmation brought a measure of closure, but also opened up new questions and new pain. They finally knew what had happened to Miranda, but they still didn't know who was responsible or why this had happened to their daughter and sister. The search for Miranda was over, but the search for justice was just beginning. The news of Miranda's identification made headlines across Houston and beyond. The story of a young woman who disappeared during Hurricane Harvey and was found 5 years later in a barbecue pit captured public attention and raised questions about safety, crime, and the vulnerability of young people in urban areas. Miranda's family had to navigate the complex emotions that came with finally having answers. They had to plan funeral services for someone who had been missing for nearly 6 years. They had to begin the process of grieving, not just for Miranda's death, but for the years of uncertainty and hope that had now come to an end. The family also had to deal with the media attention that followed the identification. Miranda's story was compelling and tragic, and news outlets across the country picked up the story. While the family appreciated the attention that might help bring justice for Miranda, they also had to balance their need for privacy with the public's interest in the case. With Miranda's remains identified, the Houston Police Department began a full homicide investigation. The circumstances of her death were clearly suspicious. Human remains don't end up burned in residential barbecue pits by accident. This was a crime scene, and investigators were determined to find out who was responsible for Miranda's death. The investigation focused on several key areas. First, investigators had to establish a timeline of events. When had Miranda died? When had her remains been placed in the barbecue pit? Who had access to the property during the relevant time periods? These questions were crucial to understanding what had happened to Miranda and identifying potential suspects. The property on Peach Creek Drive became a focal point of the investigation. Investigators interviewed current and former residents, neighbors, and anyone who might have had access to the backyard where Miranda's remains were found. They were looking for anyone who might have information about how the remains ended up there. The investigation also involved a careful examination of Miranda's life in the days and weeks before her disappearance. Investigators interviewed her friends, family members, and anyone who might have had contact with her around the time she vanished. They were looking for clues about what might have happened to her and who might have been responsible. The timing of Miranda's disappearance during Hurricane Harvey created both challenges and opportunities for the investigation. On one hand, the chaos and displacement caused by the hurricane made it difficult to establish a clear timeline of events. On the other hand, the hurricane provided a unique timeframe that might help investigators narrow down when and how Miranda's death occurred. Investigators also had to consider the possibility that Miranda's death was connected to other crimes or missing persons cases. The unusual circumstances of her case, the fact that she disappeared during a natural disaster and was found years later in such unusual circumstances, raised questions about whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. The Houston Police Department worked closely with the Harris County District Attorney's Office to ensure that the investigation was thorough and that any evidence collected would be admissible in court. They understood that solving Miranda's case was not just about finding answers for her family, but about bringing justice for a young woman whose life had been cut short by violence. As the investigation progressed, police followed up on tips and leads from the public. Miranda's story had captured widespread attention, and people came forward with information that might be relevant to the case. Each tip had to be carefully evaluated and followed up on, even if most of them ultimately proved to be dead ends. The investigation also involved forensic analysis of the barbecue pit and the surrounding area. Investigators were looking for any physical evidence that might provide clues about what had happened to Miranda and who might have been responsible. This included DNA evidence, fingerprints, and any other trace evidence that might have survived the fire and the passage of time. As of late 2023, the investigation into Miranda Rodriguez's murder remained active. The Houston Police Department continued to follow leads, interview witnesses, and work toward identifying the person or persons responsible for her death. The case had been officially classified as a homicide, and investigators were treating it with the seriousness and urgency that such cases demand. The unusual circumstances of Miranda's case, her disappearance during Hurricane Harvey and the discovery of her remains in a barbecue pit 5 years later, had captured public attention and generated numerous tips and leads. While many of these tips didn't provide useful information, investigators continued to follow up on anything that might help solve the case. In November 2023, a monetary reward was announced for information leading to an arrest in Miranda's case. The reward was intended to incentivize anyone with information about her death to come forward and assist with the investigation. The Rodriguez family hoped that the reward might encourage someone who had been reluctant to speak up to finally provide the information that could bring justice for Miranda. The family also continued their efforts to keep Miranda's story in the public eye. They understood that public attention was crucial to maintaining momentum in the investigation, and they were determined not to let their daughter and sister be forgotten. They participated in interviews, maintained social media accounts dedicated to Miranda's memory, and worked with victim advocacy groups to raise awareness about her case. The Houston Police Department assured the family and the public that Miranda's case remained a priority. They continued to work with forensic experts, follow up on leads, and pursue every possible avenue for solving the case. They understood that Miranda's family deserved answers, and they were committed to providing those answers through a thorough and professional investigation. The case also highlighted broader issues about safety, violence against women, and the vulnerability of young people in urban areas. Miranda's story became part of a larger conversation about how communities can work together to protect their most vulnerable members and ensure that crimes like this don't go unpunished. Victim advocacy groups used Miranda's case as an example of the importance of never giving up hope and continuing to search for answers, even when cases seem impossible to solve. They pointed out that Miranda's remains might never have been found if not for the routine work of landscapers cleaning up a backyard, and that justice might still be possible even in cases that have gone unsolved for years. The Rodriguez family also worked to honor Miranda's memory through positive action. They participated in events for other missing persons, supported other families going through similar experiences, and worked to ensure that Miranda would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a person who had touched many lives and deserved to be remembered with love and respect. As we bring Miranda Rodriguez's story to a close tonight, we're left with a complex mix of emotions. There's sadness at the loss of a young woman whose life was cut short by violence. There's frustration at the questions that remain unanswered. But there's also admiration for a family that never gave up hope and never stopped searching for their daughter and sister. Miranda's case reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. She wasn't just a victim, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a member of her community. Her disappearance left a hole in the lives of everyone who knew her, and her death represents not just a crime to be solved, but a life that was precious and worthy of justice. The discovery of Miranda's remains after nearly 6 years also reminds us that answers can come when we least expect them. Her family never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, and never stopped believing that someday they would find out what had happened to their loved one. Their persistence and dedication were finally rewarded with answers, even if those answers brought as much pain as relief. Miranda's story also highlights the importance of community in solving crimes and supporting families of victims. It was ordinary people, workers cleaning up a backyard, who found Miranda's remains. It was members of the community who shared her story, provided tips to investigators, and kept her case in the public eye. It was the collective effort of many people that finally brought answers to her family. As you settle into sleep tonight, remember Miranda Rodriguez not just as a victim of violence, but as a person who was loved and missed. Remember the importance of community, the value of persistence, and the hope that even in the darkest times, answers can still be found. Remember that justice may be slow, but it's worth pursuing, and that every person deserves to be remembered with dignity and respect. The investigation into Miranda's murder continues, and there's still hope that whoever was responsible for her death will be brought to justice. Until then, her family continues to seek answers, her community continues to support them, and her memory continues to be honored by all who knew her story. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, we'll explore the case of Kelly Allen, a young woman whose disappearance in 2007 remains one of Missouri's most puzzling missing person cases. This is a story about hope, ambition, and the inexplicable moment when someone simply vanishes from existence. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge Kelly's family and friends who continue to search for answers. This story is told with respect for Kelly and those who love her. So let me transport you to St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 2007. In March 2007, Kelly Allen was 20 years old and her life was filled with promise. She lived with her mother in St. Louis, Missouri, in a world that was rapidly changing around her. The iPhone hadn't been released yet, social media was still in its infancy, and young people like Kelly still relied on phone calls and face-to-face conversations to stay connected. Kelly was a nursing student, drawn to a profession that required both academic dedication and genuine compassion. Those who knew her described her as someone who cared deeply about others, the kind of person who would naturally gravitate toward helping those in need. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, with brown hair that she often wore in microbraids, and striking hazel eyes that seemed to reflect her warm personality. Beyond her studies, Kelly worked as a home caregiver, a job that perfectly suited her nurturing nature. She would spend her days helping elderly clients with their daily routines, providing not just physical assistance but emotional support and companionship. It was meaningful work, though Kelly knew she wanted to expand her career opportunities. Kelly had distinctive tattoos that reflected her personality, brown eyes and a flower on her left shoulder, and a small half-moon behind her left ear. These weren't just decorative choices, they were expressions of who she was becoming as a young woman finding her place in the world. The spring of 2007 held particular significance for Kelly. She was nearing completion of her nursing degree, an achievement that would open doors to better career opportunities and financial stability. She was also actively seeking employment closer to her St. Louis home, hoping to reduce her commute and spend more time with family and friends. Those who knew Kelly described her as reliable, responsible, and deeply connected to her family. She wasn't the type of person to disappear without explanation or to abandon her responsibilities. Her life was structured around her studies, her work, and her relationships with the people who mattered most to her. On March 7, 2007, Kelly made a decision that would unknowingly set the stage for one of Missouri's most enduring mysteries. She decided to visit a female friend who lived in Berkeley, Missouri, a small city in St. Louis County with a population of around 9,000 people. Berkeley was a working-class community, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and unusual events were quickly noticed. Kelly's friend lived in an apartment in the 8600 block of Frost Avenue, a quiet residential area lined with modest homes and small apartment buildings. Kelly's decision to stay with her friend for several days wasn't unusual. Young adults often crash at friends' places, especially when they're between jobs or need a change of scenery. For Kelly, it might have been a welcome break from her routine, a chance to spend time with a friend while she continued her job search. During those 5 days, from March 7 through March 12, Kelly settled into a temporary routine at her friend's apartment. She continued looking for work, making phone calls, and preparing for interviews. Her friend went to work each day, leaving Kelly alone in the apartment for hours at a time. The atmosphere in the apartment was comfortable and familiar. Kelly had left some personal belongings there, including clothes and personal items that suggested she was planning to stay for at least a few more days. Among these belongings was something particularly significant, a $2,000 tax refund check that Kelly had received but hadn't yet cashed. This detail would later prove crucial to investigators. The check represented a substantial amount of money for a college student working part-time jobs. The fact that Kelly left it behind, uncashed, suggested that whatever happened to her was sudden and unexpected. Someone planning to disappear voluntarily would have taken such a significant sum of money with them. During this week, Kelly maintained her normal patterns of communication. She spoke regularly with her family, updating them on her job search and her plans. There were no signs of distress, no indication that she was planning to leave or that she was in any kind of danger. The friend later told investigators that Kelly seemed relaxed and optimistic during her stay. She was looking forward to potential job opportunities and spoke about her plans for the future. There was nothing in her behavior or conversation that suggested she was contemplating disappearing or that she was afraid of anything or anyone. March 13, 2007, started like any other day for Kelly Allen. She woke up in her friend's apartment on Frost Avenue in Berkeley, Missouri, with plans that seemed routine and unremarkable. The weather was typical for mid-March in Missouri, cool but not cold, with the promise of spring in the air. Kelly had secured a job interview that day with a telemarketing company located on Watson Road. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was exactly what Kelly was looking for: employment closer to her St. Louis home that would reduce her commute and provide steady income while she finished her nursing degree. The morning routine was familiar by now. Kelly's friend prepared for her own workday, and they likely shared coffee and conversation before the friend left for work. Kelly was comfortable being alone in the apartment. She had been staying there for nearly a week and had settled into the rhythm of the space. The job interview was scheduled for some time during the day. Kelly dressed appropriately for the meeting, choosing clothes that would make a good impression while still reflecting her personality. She gathered any documents she might need, her resume, references, identification, and prepared to leave for Watson Road. Before her friend left for work, they spoke briefly. The friend would later tell investigators that Kelly seemed in good spirits, perhaps even excited about the job opportunity. There was nothing unusual about Kelly's demeanor or behavior. She appeared focused and optimistic about the interview. At some point during the day, Kelly's friend called her from work. This phone conversation would become one of the last confirmed communications with Kelly Allen. During the call, Kelly sounded normal, perhaps a bit nervous about the interview, but otherwise fine. She didn't mention any concerns, didn't express fear or anxiety about anything, and didn't suggest that she was planning to go anywhere other than the job interview. Kelly left the apartment on Frost Avenue and traveled to Watson Road for her interview with the telemarketing company. The distance between Berkeley and Watson Road wasn't significant. It was a journey that should have taken less than 30 minutes by car or public transportation. The interview apparently went well. Kelly not only impressed the interviewer but was asked to return for a follow-up interview in the near future. This was exactly the kind of positive outcome Kelly had been hoping for. She had successfully navigated the first step in the hiring process and was positioned to secure the job she wanted. After the interview, Kelly's movements become unclear. She should have returned to her friend's apartment in Berkeley, but what happened during those crucial hours remains a mystery. Did she stop somewhere along the way? Did she meet someone? Did she encounter an unexpected situation that changed her plans? When Kelly's friend returned from work that evening, she expected to find Kelly at the apartment, perhaps excited about how the interview had gone. Instead, she found an empty apartment. Kelly's belongings were still there, her clothes, personal items, and that significant $2,000 tax refund check, but Kelly herself was nowhere to be found. The first night Kelly didn't return to her friend's apartment, there might have been reasonable explanations. Perhaps she had decided to go home to St. Louis without collecting her belongings. Maybe she had spontaneously decided to visit another friend or family member. Young adults sometimes change their plans without notice, especially in an era before constant cell phone communication. But as hours turned into a full day, and then another day, the absence became more concerning. Kelly's friend tried to reach her, but there was no response. Phone calls went unanswered. Kelly, who had been reliable and communicative during her stay, had simply vanished. The friend contacted Kelly's family in St. Louis. Had Kelly returned home? Had she been in touch with her mother or other family members? The answers were troubling. Kelly's family hadn't heard from her either. She hadn't come home, hadn't called, hadn't given any indication of her whereabouts or intentions. Kelly's mother, Tracy, began to feel the first stirrings of genuine fear. She knew her daughter's habits, her patterns of communication, her sense of responsibility. Kelly wasn't the type of person to disappear without explanation, especially not when she had a follow-up job interview scheduled and personal belongings left behind. The family tried to think of logical explanations. Had Kelly met someone? Had she decided to extend her stay somewhere else? Had she encountered some kind of emergency that prevented her from contacting them? They called other friends and family members, hoping someone had heard from Kelly or knew where she might be. Meanwhile, back in Berkeley, Kelly's friend was dealing with her own growing anxiety. The apartment felt different with Kelly's belongings still there but Kelly herself missing. The $2,000 tax refund check sat uncashed, a clear indication that Kelly hadn't planned to leave permanently. Days passed with no word from Kelly. The follow-up job interview that had represented such hope and opportunity came and went. Kelly didn't appear for the appointment. For someone who had been actively seeking employment and had just successfully completed a first interview, this absence was particularly alarming. Kelly's family knew they had to act. This wasn't a case of a young adult being temporarily unreachable or changing plans without notice. This was something more serious. Kelly Allen had vanished completely, leaving behind not just her belongings but her entire life structure, her job, her studies, her family, her future plans. The decision was made to contact the police. Kelly's disappearance was officially reported to the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. The case was assigned to investigators who would begin the painstaking process of trying to understand what had happened to Kelly Allen on March 13, 2007. When the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department began investigating Kelly Allen's disappearance, they faced the challenging reality of a case with very few concrete leads. Kelly had vanished somewhere between leaving a job interview and returning to her friend's apartment, a gap of several hours that could have taken her anywhere in the greater St. Louis area. The investigators started with the basics: Kelly's last known movements, her relationships, her habits, and any potential threats in her life. They interviewed her friend extensively, trying to understand Kelly's state of mind during the week she had been staying at the apartment and any details about her plans on March 13. The friend cooperated fully with the investigation, providing detailed information about Kelly's activities, conversations, and behavior during her stay. Nothing in these interviews suggested that Kelly was planning to leave voluntarily or that she was afraid of anyone or anything. The friend described Kelly as optimistic about her job prospects and looking forward to completing her nursing degree. Investigators also interviewed Kelly's family members, friends, and acquaintances in St. Louis. They were trying to build a complete picture of Kelly's life and identify anyone who might have had reason to harm her or who might know something about her disappearance. The telemarketing company on Watson Road was contacted to verify Kelly's interview and gather any information about her visit. The company confirmed that Kelly had indeed interviewed for a position and had been invited back for a follow-up interview. The interviewer described Kelly as professional and enthusiastic about the job opportunity. Police canvassed the area around the telemarketing company, showing Kelly's photograph to nearby businesses and residents. They were looking for anyone who might have seen Kelly after her interview, hoping to establish her movements during those crucial missing hours. The investigation also focused on potential routes Kelly might have taken between Watson Road and Berkeley. Had she taken public transportation? Had someone given her a ride? Had she walked part of the way? Without witnesses or surveillance footage, these questions remained unanswered. One particularly significant aspect of the investigation was the $2,000 tax refund check that Kelly had left behind. Investigators checked with banks and financial institutions to see if anyone had attempted to cash or deposit the check. The check remained untouched, supporting the theory that Kelly's disappearance was involuntary. The police also looked into Kelly's background for any history of depression, substance abuse, or previous disappearances. They found none. Kelly was described consistently as a responsible, goal-oriented young woman who maintained close relationships with family and friends. There was no evidence of any mental health issues or personal problems that might have motivated her to disappear voluntarily. As the investigation progressed, investigators began to suspect that Kelly had been the victim of foul play. Her disappearance had all the hallmarks of an involuntary vanishing. She left behind money and personal belongings, she failed to show up for important appointments, and she completely ceased all communication with family and friends. As news of Kelly Allen's disappearance spread through the St. Louis community, it sparked a response that demonstrated both the best of human nature and the desperate need for answers. Kelly's family, friends, and even strangers began mobilizing to help find her. Flyers with Kelly's photograph and description were printed and distributed throughout the St. Louis area. Her image, a young woman with brown hair in microbraids and hazel eyes, appeared on bulletin boards, in store windows, and on telephone poles. The flyers included details about her height, 5 feet 4 inches, weight, approximately 160 pounds, and distinctive tattoos. The local media picked up Kelly's story, broadcasting her photograph and the circumstances of her disappearance on television news programs and publishing articles in newspapers. The coverage helped raise awareness about Kelly's case and reached people who might have information about her disappearance. Kelly's family organized search parties, enlisting volunteers to help look for any signs of her in areas she might have visited. These searches were both practical efforts to find evidence and emotional outlets for people who felt helpless in the face of Kelly's mysterious disappearance. The African American community in St. Louis was particularly mobilized by Kelly's case. Missing persons cases involving young black women often receive less media attention and fewer resources than cases involving white victims, but Kelly's family and community advocates worked to ensure her story remained visible. Social media was still in its early stages in 2007, but Kelly's family and friends used whatever online platforms were available to share information about her disappearance. They created web pages and forum posts, hoping to reach people who might have seen Kelly or who might have information about what happened to her. The nursing school where Kelly was studying held vigils and prayer services for her safe return. Her classmates and instructors described her as a dedicated student who was passionate about her chosen profession. They couldn't understand why someone with such clear goals and strong family connections would simply vanish. Kelly's mother, Tracy, became a tireless advocate for her daughter. She gave interviews to local media, participated in search efforts, and worked with police investigators to keep the case active. Tracy's determination to find answers about her daughter's disappearance would continue for years. The case also attracted the attention of organizations that specialize in missing persons cases. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children created age-progressed photographs of Kelly, showing how she might look as she grew older. These images were distributed in hopes that someone might recognize an older version of Kelly. As months and then years passed without any significant breaks in Kelly Allen's case, investigators and Kelly's family were forced to consider various theories about what might have happened to her. Each potential explanation raised new questions and led to new avenues of investigation. One theory focused on the possibility that Kelly had been the victim of a random crime. The area between Watson Road and Berkeley included both urban and suburban neighborhoods where such incidents could occur. Perhaps Kelly had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, encountering someone with criminal intentions. Another theory suggested that Kelly might have been targeted by someone who knew her routine or who had been watching her. Her regular presence at her friend's apartment and her job-seeking activities could have made her vulnerable to someone who planned to harm her. Investigators also considered whether Kelly might have been the victim of human trafficking. Young women, particularly those who appear to be alone or in transitional life situations, can be targeted by traffickers. Kelly's disappearance without a trace could potentially fit this pattern. The possibility that Kelly had voluntarily disappeared was also examined, though it seemed increasingly unlikely given the evidence. The uncashed tax refund check, her failure to appear for the follow-up job interview, and her complete cessation of contact with family and friends all argued against voluntary disappearance. In 2012, 5 years after Kelly's disappearance, there was a moment of hope when her cousin reported seeing someone who looked like Kelly on a train. The cousin was convinced enough to take a photograph of the woman, and the image was turned over to police investigators. The photograph showed a woman who shared some physical characteristics with Kelly, but the image quality and angle made positive identification difficult. Investigators worked to enhance the photograph and compare it to Kelly's known features, but they were unable to definitively determine whether the woman in the image was Kelly Allen. This potential sighting raised tantalizing questions. If the woman in the photograph was indeed Kelly, it would mean she was alive years after her disappearance. But it would also raise difficult questions about why she hadn't contacted her family and what had happened to her during those missing years. The investigation into the photograph continued for months, but ultimately, investigators couldn't confirm the woman's identity. The sighting remained a possible lead but not a definitive answer to the mystery of Kelly Allen's disappearance. Today, more than 17 years after Kelly Allen vanished on that March day in 2007, her case remains an open investigation with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. The detectives who originally worked on the case have retired, replaced by new investigators who have inherited the file and the responsibility to continue searching for answers. Kelly's family, led by her mother Tracy, has never given up hope of finding out what happened to their daughter and sister. They continue to mark the anniversary of her disappearance each year, sharing her story and asking anyone with information to come forward. The case has been featured in various true crime publications and podcasts, helping to keep Kelly's story alive for new audiences. Each time her case is discussed, there's hope that someone who knows something will finally decide to speak up. Modern technology has opened new possibilities for investigating cold cases like Kelly's. DNA analysis, cell phone tracking, and digital forensics weren't as advanced in 2007 as they are today. Investigators continue to review the evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. Kelly would be 37 years old today. Her family and friends imagine what her life might have been like if she hadn't disappeared. She would likely have completed her nursing degree, perhaps started a family, and continued the caring work that seemed to define her character. The $2,000 tax refund check that Kelly left behind, uncashed, has become a symbol of the life she was building and the future that was interrupted. It represents not just money, but plans, hopes, and the normal progression of a young woman's life that was suddenly and inexplicably halted. For anyone listening tonight who might have information about Kelly Allen's disappearance, the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department continues to investigate her case. They can be reached at 314-444-5738, and there's also an email address for missing persons cases, missingpersons@mshp.dps.mo.gov. Kelly's story reminds us that behind every missing person case is a family that continues to love and search for their lost member. Her disappearance represents not just a mystery to be solved, but a life that mattered and continues to matter to those who knew her. As we conclude tonight's story, we remember Kelly Allen not just as a missing person, but as a young woman with dreams, aspirations, and people who loved her. Her case remains open, her family continues to hope, and somewhere, perhaps, are the answers that could finally bring resolution to this enduring mystery. Until those answers come, Kelly's story serves as a reminder to hold our loved ones close, to appreciate the ordinary moments that make up our lives, and to never give up hope that even the most puzzling mysteries can eventually be solved. If you have information about Kelly Allen's disappearance, please contact the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.